Hello and welcome to the first International Agnon Festival to our viewers in Israel and abroad. אירוע זה יתקיים בשפה האנגלית. מי שרוצה תרגום סימולטני לעברית ניתן ללחוץ על כפתור ה-interpretation למטה במסך על הגלובוס ועל השפה העברית. We are very happy to be here with you and to host here Jonathan Safran Foer and Etgar Keret. They are going to talk about animals and being Jewish fathers, of very Agnonian topics. And for the opening of this event, we decided to read for you something of Agnon from his Nobel Prize winning speech. I will read this in Hebrew, and you can see the translation into English. And this is what he says in Stockholm 1966 in a Nobel Prize winning speech. כדי לא לקפח שכר כל בריאה, חייב אני להזכיר בהמות, חיות ועופות שלמדתי מהם. כבר אמר איוב, מלפנו מבהמות ארץ ומעוף השמיים יחכמנו. מקצת מה שלמדתי מהם כתבתי על ספריי, אבל חוששני שלא למדתי כל צורכי. הרי ששמעתי כל כלב נובח, כל ציפור מצייצת, כל תרנגול קורא, איני יודע אם מודים לי על כל מה שסיפרתי עליהם, אם קוראים עליי תיגר. So now I want to introduce you, the moderator of this event, Kathrine Tschemerinsky, writer and editor at the Danish newspaper Weekendavisen. Hello, Kathrine, and good evening.
Good evening. Good evening. And good evening, Jonathan and Edgar. I'm so excited that you're here tonight to join in this conversation. And choosing to start the event with this quote by Agnon, I came across it a few weeks ago, and I just thought that it was incredible to think about the fact that he went to Sweden in 1966 and addressed the world public in Hebrew. And aside from that, I think he was the only one ever to use his Nobel lecture to address the animals directly, and not just to thank them, but actually to thank them for what they taught him. And to start tonight, I would actually like to ask both of you what animals taught you.
Come on, Jonathan, you're the more respectable one. You should go first.
I would have said the same thing, except now your hair is so gray that I'm wondering if you're the most respectable one. What have animals? I assume we mean non-human animals, which is like the beginning.
Yes.
But I say that as a joke, but also seriously, because we often forget, I think to our own detriment, that when we say animal, we're not talking about something that isn't us. We are talking about a group that includes lots of things that aren't us and also includes us. And remembering that we are part of that community is something that a lot of contemporary culture urges us to forget. To forget our connection to, whether it is the animals that we eat, the animals that are in zoos, the pets that we keep in our homes, the birds that fly in the sky, or the birds that are kept in the captivity of factory farms that are cultivating the kinds of viruses like coronavirus that are probably, more than anything else, the greatest threat to our species. We forget that we're a part of that. I grew up actually quite afraid of animals. And I have a little bit of residual fear of animals, but I was raised in Washington, D.C. in a very urban setting, in a very Jewish home. And Jewish families are known for a lot of things, but love of animals really isn't one of them. They were considered sort of fed, like who needs that? Who needs that mess? Who needs that noise? And why on earth would you give food to an animal when you could give food to children and grandchildren? And it wasn't until I got a dog, this was probably 15 years ago, that I had any intimate relationship with non-human animals. And I began very afraid of this dog, whose name was George, even when we shared a house. And I would have to put her food bowl in the room, and then I would leave the room. because I didn't know how to share a space with her. And, you know, the way I often talk about her and think about her, which will probably sound like I'm exaggerating or making a joke, is that she probably changed my life more than any living thing until I had a child. Changed everything from, you know, how I view other animals to how I relate to my own body and how I inhabit my own body. You know, Jewish.
What do you mean by that, actually?
Well, Jews, you know, are people of the book, and people of the book are people of their minds. We don't read books with our bodies unless we're blind. You know, we use our eyes, obviously, but only as an interface to our minds. And the emphasis when I grew up, and I would say, like, this is probably not wholly true, but broadly true, that Jewish people put the emphasis on the life of the mind rather than the life of the body, which is one of the things that made the creation of Israel, or it was sort of woven through this sort of Zionist dream, is that Jews could become people of the body as much as they have been people of the mind, to reimagine our relationship to the earth, to reimagine our relationship to the food that we eat. You know, that was part of the dream of reinventing the Jewish people in the land of Israel, along with many, many, many other aspects, of course, and more important aspects, but that was one of them. So, you know, obviously I'm in America and not in Israel. And it wasn't until I started interacting on a daily basis with animals that I was able to get, I think, the balance a little bit more right, from how much time I spend up here to how much time I spend touching things in the world.
I think you're opening up to a lot of the topics we're going to talk about tonight, but what about you, Etgar?
Yeah, well, I totally identify with all the stuff that Jonathan is speaking about. I think I want to say that all my life I spoke to animals. I think it's both because of the fact that my family always spoke to animals, and also the fact that usually when I would speak to people, they wouldn't answer. So when I spoke to animals and they didn't answer, it seemed kind of like it just seemed to be kind of okay, because it seemed as if the entire creation didn't understand me on the same level. But I feel that there was something in this kind of belief that I'm communicating with them, you know, that I speak to them and that they understand me. That first of all, there was something, it's a little bit of a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, I feel. You know, it's kind of, I talked our rabbit, you know, from peeing in the house. Like I had a rabbit to rabbit conversation, and I explained to him that it will really be, you know, against his interests if he do it. And my wife thought that it was very, very silly, but he stopped peeing, you know. So I don't know. Like, I mean, there's probably another explanation for that, but there is something kind of a very natural in engaging this kind of dialogue. But also more than that, I always feel that when I speak with animals, that they have this ability to be in the present, which is something that I've never possessed. And I think that I was always attracted to writing because of that, because when I make up a character and I write a story, then, you know, then the fact that I just started thinking about this guy 5 minutes ago helps me be with this guy's present, you know, and figure out his past from his present, and not the other way around, where I keep dragging my past every place I go. And I feel that my urge always to communicate with animals was this kind of idea to have this kind of a feedback that is confined to the present, that you know, that you're happy when you're happy, and you don't really care what happened 5 minutes ago, and you don't carry those anxieties that goes with you to the future. I feel that this was always part of my yearning to interact with animals, as if I believe that they can teach me that.
Well, you know, Etgar, first of all, I haven't yet said thank you both of you for being here tonight. Etgar is one of my oldest and best friends, and if someone were to say to me, you had to be stuck on a desert island for the rest of your life with only one person to talk to, I would probably choose Etgar. There's nobody that I enjoy listening to more or feel that I learn from more. But what you were saying about talking to the rabbit, they've done these studies where they brought mice into a laboratory and had scientists test how the speed with which they move through mazes. And half of the mice were labeled intelligent and half of the mice were labeled average. And they ran these tests for several weeks, and the intelligent mice scored better, had better times. But it was a psychological experiment that was actually being conducted on the scientists, because the mice were all identical. There were no intelligent and less intelligent mice. But what it proved was that when we assume intelligence on the part of an animal, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, like Etgar was saying. And of course, that's instructive for parents as well. Like what we, when we assume ability on the part of our kids, they become able. When we assume fragility, they become fragile. The other thing about talking to an animal is sort of like talking to God, like praying. Maybe someone hears you, maybe they don't, but what is undeniably true is that it changes you to say it out loud, and it changes you to make the assumption that what you are saying matters, and that it is the act of saying, I mean, it's like a very Jewish thing, that the act of articulation makes something. It changes the world. In the beginning of Genesis, God said, let there be light, and there was light. He didn't say, let there be light, and then wave the magic wand, and then there was thunder, and then it just, by saying it, it became true. And there's something about communicating with animals when you don't even know what's on the other side of your communication, but the act of that talking brings something into being that otherwise wouldn't have existed.
Yeah, I think it's kind of acknowledging the possibility of empathy and understanding. It's like saying, when you say about praying, say, I'm not sure that he understands what I'm saying, but maybe he understands what I'm saying, and that's good enough, for me to try and make this attempt. It's funny, maybe it's totally unrelated, but when I see Jonathan, I always have this urge to tell him weird stuff. So it just that they're doing a construction in a building, and they building those things. I don't know, that they put them outside so people can climb and paint the exterior wall. How do you call those things?
Scaffolding.
Scaffolding. So they do those scaffolding around our home. And I've been living here for almost 30 years. And at night, so I go to the balcony and smoke. And I was after this kind of a Zoom panel like ours, but less good. And they asked me what is writing. And whenever they ask me something very, very abstract, I get into my Bibi Netanyahu mode, and I say, this is a good question, but this is not the most important question. The most important question is, what are we doing to stop Iran from getting, and I kind of wiggled my way out of this question that I had no answer to. And it kind of frustrated me, because I was thinking to myself, I've been writing for more than 30 years. Like, I should know what is writing, I mean, it's kind of embarrassing that I didn't have a good answer. And when I opened the door to the balcony, I saw that there is a cat that is always in our yard, like he has a name, and we know him, but for the first time in my life, I saw him in my balcony because he used the scaffold to climb. And there is one chair in the balcony, it's my smoking chair. Only I sit in it and smoke. And he was sitting kind of upright in this chair, and he was looking at me like he gave me this very kind of a noble British look, kind of, oh, peasants, I think I have some kind of insights to share with you. And I was kind of looking at the cat, and the cat was looking at me, and I guess it was a period of time that we were staring at each other, because my son came and he kind of hit me on the shoulder and he said, Dad, everything's all right, and went, food for the cat, and the cat kind of ran away. And I said, yeah, everything is okay. So he said, so why were you standing for the last 5 minutes looking at the cat? And he said, well, I said to him, well, I was waiting for him to speak. There was this kind of like situation. I was waiting for him to say something. It looked as if there was something he wanted to say. And then my son said, oh, Dad, you're so funny, and just kind of walked away. And I thought to myself, this is exactly what writing is about, kind of waiting for the cat to talk, in a sense. It's kind of like as if we live in a life, with many people like my child pulling us into reality and taking us all through those alleys of pragmatics and possible. And there are those moments where you wait for the cat to talk, and if you really want to kind of preserve this moment, this is when you start writing. You can write your conversations with your cat, you can write about the cat not wanting to speak to you, but it felt like it was this kind of a portal, and looking at the cat and writing kind of, I don't know, felt the same.
No, I think that I often think of writing as also a way of making things matter. The moment you put them into words, it's a little bit like what you said before, Jonathan, about, like uttering things and suddenly they become, right? And by writing, turning things into text, you sort of emphasize something. And, preparing for this talk, I suddenly realized that both of your books are so full of animals, looking at Fly Already, for example, Etgar, right? There is a dog that completely takes over the life of a couple. There is a goldfish that gets up at night and, puts on slippers and watches television. There is a father that allegedly turns into a bunny. And you, Jonathan, I mean, you wrote, like, already in 2009, your book about eating animals and the whole industry of producing animals. And could you say something about turning animals into something that matters?
I don't think one has to turn animals into something that matters. I think that people have to be talked out of believing that they matter. You'll never meet a child who would say animals don't matter. I'm not talking about whether or not we eat them. I'm not even talking about whether or not we hunt them. Just that I probably evolutionarily, we are born with an instinct to care about them. I've never in my entire life met a person who is indifferent to animals. I am sure that there is not a participant on this, anybody who's watching this right now, who would be completely indifferent to a dog getting kicked on the street. I don't think we have to overcome our indifference. I think we have to overcome some of our habits. Children, I assume most children have a moment when they are confused by the fact that we eat animals. And again, this is not to say that it's right or wrong, and it's not, obviously most of them end up eating animals, but every other thing that we teach them about animals is of a kind. It has a sort of like a moral to it. We have pets that we treat as if they are members of our family, not equal or not the same, but members of our family. We read them books that have almost always heroes, animals as heroes. Kids have stuffed animals that they go to sleep with. And then there's this other thing that we do, which is we kill them, cut them apart, and eat their bodies. And again, this is not to say that that's necessarily wrong, but it is definitely not in keeping with the other stories that we teach kids. And so it creates a confusion. And, all of our lives are overflowing with confusions, and we find ways to be distracted from most of them, or just to get over them, or to somehow reconcile them. And some of them remain confusing. And most of the vegetarians I know are not so sure about what's right and wrong, but they are unable to overcome their confusion. That's how I feel. I'm with my little brother right now, actually, in upstate New York, and we went for a hike this morning, and he was asking me, would I ever want to go fishing in this lake that we were walking past? And I said, I don't think so. And he said, well, why not? And I said, you know, there are a lot of ways to have fun. And I don't know that I need to do what's involved in fishing. It's to put a hook into the roof of the mouth of a living thing. Is that living thing intelligent? I have no idea. Nobody will ever know. Does it experience pain? I have no idea. But as with when Etgar was talking to animals as a child or as an adult, we cannot help, but we are forced to, just by being alive, make assumptions about other people. I have no idea if Etgar really feels pain, but I choose to believe him when he says that he does.
All the time. I'm Jewish.
I make assumptions about him. And those assumptions say a little bit about Etgar, and they say a lot about me. Like, am I going to be generous with my assumptions, or am I going to be miserly with my assumptions? Am I going to like have a circle of compassion that is expansive, or one that's very narrow, that assumes that only people like me feel things that are like me? I don't have any of the answers, but the confusion feels important to me, and it feels worth trying to respond to rather than just pretending it's not there or distracting myself. So I suspect that, and I sort of feel like this has been proven in a certain way to me just anecdotally, because I've had so many conversations about eating animals at this point. I suspect just about everybody feels some confusion. You know, even people who are farmers, even people who are chefs who specialize in cooking meat. It's very rare that you meet somebody who doesn't feel that something is unresolved. And sometimes the more certain somebody seems, the more confused they obviously are. So for example, if I remember when I used to do readings from eating animals, every now and then, it wasn't that common, but every now and then somebody would stand up and say, who are you? You know, to be telling us what to eat and what not to eat. And you think you're better than anybody else. And you can take my hamburger from my cold, dead hands. Screw you. And what I would always say in response is, well, it's obvious that we agree that there's something very important going on here, because otherwise you just wouldn't be upset. You know, if I were saying we should all drink carbonated water instead of flat water, nobody is going to stand up and say, who are you telling me what kind of water to drink? They would just ignore me or walk away. I think most people intuitively, like in their hearts, sense that something very important is going on in our relationship with food animals. And that's a great starting point. Like, it's a great starting point to say, listen, maybe I won't eat them, maybe you will eat them, maybe I think it's problematic, maybe you think it's okay, but we agree that something important is happening here.
It's funny because I became vegetarian when I was 5, and it's funny how my intuitions were almost opposite, in that sense that I remember as a child that life seemed really, really very confusing for me. Like I had dilemma about everything, you know, which kindergarten I should go to. Should I go to another child's home or refuse, you know? Should I play with my brother or I don't know, play with kids my age? Everything, it seemed to have like their ups and downs, and I had the feelings that all the time I'm losing something. And I remember that when I understood that when you eat meat, you eat animals, I had this kind of relief, and I said, okay, so here's something really, really simple, you know? It's kind of like I always see myself as some kind of a moral opportunist. When things are complicated, you know, it gets too tiring, and I just do something wrong and keep on going. But here I really had this kind of sensations that it was almost kind of an Archimedes point. It was this kind of one thing that they said, you know what, if I want to eat meat, for sure I won't do any bad to this world. I won't hurt anybody, you know, I won't like, so I can make this choice that for sure it's either good or, I don't know, neutral, but it's not bad in any way. And I remember that when I was a child, in Israel, we have those religious shows when they talk about the Bible. And I remember that just when I was kind of contemplating about that, they were talking about the flood, and before the flood, God wanted all the people to be vegan, and after the flood, He said, okay, you know what? Like, I've overestimated people, and from now on, I'm gonna make it easy for you, so you can still, you know, not sleep with your sisters and murder your neighbors. I'm very insistent about that, but actually, you know, you can kill animals and eat them. And I remember that as a child, when I heard that, it kind of shocked me, because you know, it seemed to me that it was much tougher not to kill other people, you know, when you feel scared, or when you're at war, or when you're intimidated, or when they can threaten you, than not to kill a chicken and eat it. You know, like, there's nothing scary about chicken. I can't imagine like a theoretical situation in which I feel that a chicken is threatening me or affecting my survival. So I said to myself, oh my God, like, couldn't God have done it differently? Say, you know what? Screw the 10 commandments, but just don't kill animals, because it's easy, you know, they're nice, they're cute, they're not going to hurt you, you know. So for me, it was really, really very, very simple and intuitive.
So now you mentioned the flood, Etgar, and I mean, in 2019, you, Jonathan, published the book We're the Weather, which is this call for, you know, urgent, you could say, climate change response. And I think that one of the really, really interesting points of the book is that we're experiencing some kind of, could say, storytelling crisis, that it's very, very hard to find ways to talk about this in a way that people will believe it. And can you sort of explain what it is you mean by that?
Well, I think, first of all, I should say I didn't really intend to write it as a call to action, or if it was a call to action, I was calling myself to action. You know, I am not better than anybody. I'm in fact worse than probably most people when it comes to like my carbon footprint. I think I had arrived, you know, earlier I was talking about, with respect to eating, discomforts or confusions that we feel that stay with us. I have felt a discomfort and confusion about my relationship to the science that I know about the environment. There's virtually nobody left on the planet who is a climate change denier, even in America. You know, the majority, 77% of Americans wanted the US to stay in the Paris Climate Accords, including a majority of Republicans. So there was a time in the past when the acceptance of science was the problem, but that it's not the problem now. Now the problem is people like me, and probably like the two of you, and probably like most people gathered, who, you know, pretty fully understand what's at stake, fully understand what is causing the problem, and the fact that it's a problem with a ticking clock. We don't have forever to solve it, and yet don't do much in response other than talk about it, you know, and attend the right marches and wear the right t-shirts and so on. And it just became, I guess, intolerable for me to witness my own hypocrisy. And so I wanted to learn more about what, if anything, an individual can do, and also what my own limits are, you know, in terms of changing. So it may very well be the case that the most important thing we can do is never to fly on a plane again. And I could say that I'm never going to fly on a plane again, but the reality is I will. And the reality is I will drive in cars again. And the reality is I will eat in plenty of ways that are destructive for the environment. And I have 2 children, which is overpopulation being the worst environmental problem. So I wanted to explore what was outside of me and explore what was inside of me, and see if there was a place they could intersect that could matter. And what I found, and this is not an opinion that I'm putting forth, and it's nothing controversial, is that there are activities that we do that are extremely, as individuals, that are extremely detrimental, destructive. If we all changed our individual choices, we wouldn't be able to save the planet that way. We need systemic change and legislated change. We need governments to, and corporations to behave differently. But we have no hope of saving the planet if we don't also change as individuals. It's going to be some kind of partnership or parallel efforts. And to even think about the difference between individuals and systems creates a kind of false distinction. You know, Tesla is now the most successful car company in the history of the United States. And it's not because they were legislated into being. And I don't believe it's because Elon Musk is an angel. It's because there is a demand for automobiles that are greener. And that's because of individuals who asked for it. So as we ask for things, as we make it clear that we want to live in ways that are sustainable rather than destructive, corporations will start to provide us with those choices. And we will buy more of them because it's easier once there are more available choices. And then corporations will make yet more choices available to us. And governments will then start to legislate because, like corporations, they're ultimately dependent on the will of individuals. You know, presidents and prime ministers have to be elected. Corporations have to sell things. So we shouldn't overestimate or underestimate the roles that we have to play as individuals.
But you know, but a few years ago, the writer Amitav Ghosh wrote The Great Derangement, where he raised the question, why are so few authors writing about climate change? And you sort of raise, you know, similar questions in your book, and make it a point about being that it's hard to tell that story. And why is it hard to tell that story?
For a few reasons. One is it's very complicated. It doesn't have iconic heroes and villains. It's one of the reasons why Greta Thunberg became so explosively popular, is because we finally had a hero. And we need those in stories. We also need, you know, arcs of a narrative that we can understand. And climate change involves so many different pieces, and their relationships just defy the understanding of most scientists, forget about most lay people. It's also kind of boring, you know? It would seem like it should be the most exciting story that could ever be told, the destruction of humankind. But it's kind of boring. And most people I know, including myself, don't really want to hear about it. Both because it threatens to inconvenience us, but also because it's just not that interesting after a while. So as I was writing the book, and finally, I suppose, there's the sort of question of like, what does it mean to know something as opposed to believing it? I recount this story about Karski, Jan Karski, who was in the Polish underground during the war, and smuggled himself into the Warsaw Ghetto to get the testimonies of people who were living there. And then he brought this information to America and had a meeting with Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, who's sort of thought of as one of the most intelligent people America has ever produced, himself a Jew as well, with relatives in Europe. And Karski recounted to him what the Germans were doing, what the Poles were doing. And Frankfurter listened to him and asked him a series of questions, and then said, you know, I have to tell you, I can't believe what you're telling me. And Karski said, how could you possibly say that I'm lying? Like, what incentive would I have to lie? And look at all of this testimony that I'm presenting you with. And Karski said, I didn't say that I don't trust that you're telling the truth. I'm just telling you that I am incapable of believing you. And then he says something really beautiful, which is, my mind and my heart were made in such a way that I can't believe you. And I think a lot of us confront that with climate change. We understand, and in a way, this comes back to one of the very first things we were talking about the difference between living in one's head and in one's body. I think our heads know what we need to know in terms of what climate change is and how to solve it, but our bodies don't know it. You know, we have knowledge, but that lacks belief. And it's ultimately belief that motivates action. And so we have to find a way either to push what we know from our heads into our bodies, or to just short circuit that whole question of belief with things like laws. You know, if there were laws that you just can't drive a car that gets less than 30 miles per gallon, if there were laws that said we can't use certain kinds of chemicals or air pollutants, or that we can't have factory farms, that would make it very easy. But in the absence of those laws, what do we do as individuals to overcome this problem of our own disbelief? And what I propose in We Are the Weather is we need habits that allow us not to have to make choices all the time. So if we say to ourselves, I'm somebody who just doesn't eat animal products for breakfast and lunch, it's not going to be a debate I have with myself when I look at a menu. I'm not, when I'm in a grocery store, going to list the pros and cons of picking this or that. I just don't do it ever. I just don't do it. In the same way that people who keep kosher don't have a debate every time they're, what they're going to eat. They just don't eat certain things. It spares us from having to be a good person or having to be a responsible person. Instead, it can be a little bit more robotic, actually, which is far easier. It's much easier to be a robot than a person.
And Etgar, it's a little shift, but I mean, last year when Corona happened, we communicated, and I remember you writing that you were like so productive. You were just like splurting out stories, and like the whole emergency situation was really inspiring to you. And it made me wonder about like the whole, again, this whole aspect of writing stories about things that are happening, and when do they appeal to our imagination, when do they not? And could you say something about what it was about what happened last year that was, appealing to your imagination?
Yeah, it's I live close to Dizengoff Street, which is one of the busiest streets in Tel Aviv, and I remember that one of the thoughts that I had during the Corona period was that it was the only time, except for Yom Kippur, that I could hear birds out of my window, because the buses kind of covered the sound of the buses covered the sound of the birds. And I think that for me, there was something about the pandemic that, first of all, it kind of it broke the force of inertia in our life, because I think that most of the things that we do every day are not active decisions that we make. They're just, we drop the kid to school, we go to work, we visit the sick aunt, we take the subway, we do all those kind of things because we just need to kind of go through those motions. And when everything is put to a halt, it puts the responsibility for your life on yourself, because you wake up and I don't know, and it's kind of and it's a lockdown, and you say, what am I going to do today? What am I interested in? Who would I like to speak to over the phone? Would I want to exercise more? Because I always say that I want to exercise more and I don't have time. So actually now I have time. Or would I want to cook? And I think that for me, this is very similar to the situations that I have when I sit in front of a piece of paper and I want to write a story. So I say, okay, what would I want it to be now? A pirate, a parrot, an aging sailor? I don't know. And I make this decision and I kind of delve into this life and live them. And I felt that there was something about the pandemic that, when I looked around me, I saw like families in my neighborhood. There are many kind of couples working in high tech and stuff like that. So they work for many hours. So I saw many families kind of discovering themselves, and I saw other families kind of falling apart, because the concept of a family not being something that you return home 10 p.m., watch something in Netflix with your wife and goes to bed, but the fact somebody that you spend the entire day with, some people it made them love their family more, and some people it made them realize that they don't want to be with those people around them. So there was something in it that kind of sent you to a place that I felt was very, very authentic.
And you, I mean, this whole idea of being exposed to a catastrophe or something unprecedented. I mean, it's a red thread in both of your book, all your books, basically. I mean, Jonathan, when I think about your books are about, the Holocaust, earthquakes, like great disasters of various kinds. And your short stories, I mean, Etgar, the last one I read, Gravitatia or Gravity, it's about a woman who sees her neighbor committing suicide. And that sort of spins up the whole story. And I wanted to ask you both, like, why do you think that there's this axis in your writing about, these unprecedented individual but also collective events?
For me, I can say that I'm really not interested in catastrophes, but I'm more interested in what catastrophes bring out of people. It's just that I think that when I write, I'm kind of like, I'm a very kind of stressed, tight as second generation goody two-shoe Jewish boy, and when I write, I always try to reach something that is authentic, a layer that is under the ones that I should recycle because my son is watching me and I want to set an example, but more like, oh man, I don't know, I want to break the window of this car because I don't like its color. It's like all those kind of things that I push down and I hide. I really want them to be present in my writing just so I can deal with them. And I think that there is something in catastrophe that it's kind of it allows us maybe in a sense to kind of exercise emotions or thoughts, for good and for better, that are usually kind of maybe half numb. When you talk about the Holocaust or you talk about the war, you have stories about treason and people being cowards and people being brave and people being selfless. And the truth is that I feel all the time kind of cowardly and brave and egocentric and selfless, but there is something about a certain kind of situation that breaks this social cover that kind of it creates some kind of a standard of the way that we act, and it kind of breaks it and opens it to all kinds of individualities to come out, and that's always interesting to write about and to discover in yourself.
And you, Jonathan, because when I read We Are the Weather the first time, I'm pointing at it here, that's why I'm pointing to the side, I was a bit surprised first when you started telling the story of your grandmother. After having read the book, I was so not surprised, and it made so much sense to me that you went back in your own family history, went back to the Holocaust when writing about climate change, because I think that there's a particular Jewish experience, which is that the disaster has already happened. And that sort of puts you in a different place when trying to imagine also what will come. But can you say something about like weaving those two narratives together and why that made sense to you?
Well, I was thinking a lot about why we respond or don't respond to threats. And my grandmother left her village in Poland, left her family, left her friends, sisters, aunts, uncles, parents, grandparents, was the only person who left. There was nothing that she knew that other people didn't know. She was not smarter than everybody else. I don't think she was braver than everybody else. So what is it about her? Why did she act when literally every other person did not act? And then when she came to the States with my grandfather, who she met in a displaced persons camp in Europe, he, a couple of years later, he committed suicide. And she, really like lived the kind of American dream. And I don't think that he was weaker than she was. I don't think that he was less interested in survival than she was. So those are my sort of my North Star, you know, in my life. Like my grandmother, who passed away a couple of years ago, was really the sort of the matriarch, first of all, of our family, but also the source and the subject of so many of the stories that we told. So it was inevitable. It has been inevitable for me whenever I am navigating a situation in my life that I at least think about her and her experience and what it is that she did. I certainly didn't want to, or rather the point wasn't to create an analogy between the Holocaust and climate change. It was to explore action and inaction.
And sorry, and I mean, it goes, you know, the book ends by you writing a life note to your sons, and at least as it appears in the book, it's written right after your grandmother died. And I think that another, you could say, common theme in your writing, which I really, really love, is the question of being fathers to sons and sons to fathers. And I mean, you have this life note, which is so beautifully written, you know, about that you write directly to your sons. And Etgar, I mean, one of the first stories that I ever read by you, and that I'm really never gonna forget it, is Pastrami, which is the story you wrote about experiencing an air raid with your son on the highway, and, you know, telling him this story that you're gonna play pastrami with the mother, and that's a way to make him feel comfortable in that situation. And I mean, I think that, can you say something about being fathers in situations like that? You know, what's on your mind? And, you know, what were you trying to express in your letter, Jonathan? And what were you trying to express in Pastrami?
I can say that, you know, the topic of parent-children relationship is something that always fascinated me, because I think that if I have to honestly kind of say it, you know, I don't get life. I don't really understand what's going on. I think that I look around me, it doesn't matter if it's in the political sphere or something, I feel a lot of warmth and compassion toward humanity, and I really would want to be better friends with humanity. You know, it's sometimes it's kind of awkward, but my intentions are really, really earnest and good. But I don't get it. And when you become a parent, you are in a position that you're supposed to be some kind of an interface between your child and this world. And it both kind of motivated me to be more ambitious in my attempts to understand the world around me, you know, to kind of to put it into frames, to really define the rights and wrongs and the gray areas, to do those kind of things, and also to be able to communicate it to my child in an honest way, you know, because I feel that I don't want to tell my child that I really, most of the time, don't really understand what's going on, that I'm afraid, that I'm confused, you know. And on the other hand, I don't want to be dishonest with my son. So I feel that this kind of dialogue that you have as a parent with your child, it's a much more meaningful ones than the ones that I used to have with myself before I had a parent, you know, because with me, like, I could just say to myself, oh, shut up, you know, or I could disregard myself or my emotions, or I could actually, I don't know, patronize myself. It's very easy to patronize myself. But when you see really somebody out there who really is just initiated to this world and who really wants to get it and comes with this pure heart, and then it, at least in my case, it challenges me to walk this kind of extra mile, to try to get the better of myself, to try to articulate things that I'm usually too lazy to try and articulate.
I think I have two different ways of looking at it. One is I often write about that relationship because it's my life. You know, if I were a horse breeder, I would probably write about horses a lot. Like, I'm a Jewish person, I write about being Jewish a lot. If I were Muslim, I would write about being Muslim a lot. Like, I spend the great majority of my time either being a parent or thinking about being a parent. I would say there are very few minutes in the day when it isn't somehow influencing me. So I write about it. But there's also something that Etgar was saying reminded me of like how different it is to not be the center of your own world. You know, I spent 25 years being the center of my world. When I was younger, I would walk down the street thinking that I was in a movie of my own life and that there was a soundtrack playing. When I would hear sound coming from like a store, I would believe it was the soundtrack of the movie of my life. And I was the star, of course. I stopped believing that, you know, when I had kids. It's not that I believe that they're the center of the world or that they have soundtracks of their lives. I now appreciate that this is not a movie about anybody, that we're all sort of participants in something very big. And that whereas I had been the kind of like recipient of not only attention, but care, I became a giver of attention and care. And it has a very different quality. Like, I get very, very lazy in my own life. You know, left to my own devices, which I often am, I could have like ice cream for dinner and I could watch 12 hours of television without interruption. I wouldn't feed my kids ice cream for dinner and I wouldn't let them watch 12 hours of TV without interruption. In the beginning of Eating Animals, I talk about the reason I wrote the book was because I was becoming a father, and the prospect of feeding somebody else felt so different than feeding myself because I cared in a very different way. So, you know, in ways that are beautiful and in ways that are incredibly frustrating and energy consuming. Becoming a parent has made me much more vigilant about choices, you know, an awareness of the choices that are in front of me. Etgar was speaking earlier about how we often make the mistake of thinking that the ways that we spend our time or the choices that we make are inevitable. Like, I wake up, I drop my kid off at school, I come home, I make the coffee this way, I start to work in this way, as if it had to be like that. And there were no other way that it could be. Having kids has sometimes brought me pleasure and sometimes brought me pain because largely because it feels like all the choices matter more and they're suddenly mine to make, or at least I am a larger participant in the making of them. So I don't actually think that having kids has influenced my fiction at all. I don't think I write differently because I have kids, but I don't think I would have written any nonfiction if I hadn't had kids.
I can say that for me, I feel that it influenced my writing completely. It's like I think very much like Jonathan was saying that before you were a father, you thought that you hear the soundtrack of your life. Then even before I became a parent, I would write all the time about a child-parent relationship, but I would always write about them from the child perspective. And I really feel that since becoming a parent, I began writing about them on the parent's perspective, or in some perspective that includes both the child and the parent. And listening to Jonathan, what my feeling was that when I'm in relationship with my son, I find a lot of freedom. I grew up I think not in a very standard family, because my parents were both Holocaust survivors and my mother was orphaned in a very young age. And when she raised us, she always said that because she grew up in orphanages in which the system was against the kids, then she never accepted the system. You know, whatever they were asking them to do, it wasn't in their own interest. They never felt love or empathy behind it. So she said, I don't like this system, I'm going to make us our own system. And this system was really, really very, very strange. Like one thing that I always like to talk about is the fact that my mother had this law that if it rains, we don't have to go to school, because it's not nothing they teach you there is important enough to get wet for. That was her quote. So I think that when I became a parent, I really understood that a lot of the kind of agreements and rules and pacts that I had with my parents are ones that I cannot take out to the world. You know, the world would not accept it. You know, I will not find a school that will cancel its studies when it rains. You know, only my mom can say that. And I think that this place that is kind of chaotic and anarchistic, but also kind of a little bubble, is for me also something that I seek all the time in parenthood. This idea that I can sit with my son and say to him, you know, this is the law, and everybody does it, but it's bullshit. So you can do it when nobody looks. And I'm not saying it because I feel for a moment that I'm cooler because I'm a parent who says, you know, like one of the first thing I remember, the first time my son said to me something that wasn't truthful, then I had this kind of father to son talk, you know, like when you talk about sex or something, and I said to him, look, all the people in the world lie. You know, some people are not aware of it, but everybody lies. And because it's something that everybody does, then you should have some kind of a system in which you will explain to yourself when it's okay to lie, when it's so to lie, when it's actually wonderful to lie. But you should kind of work it out, because right now you're just kind of lying randomly and you're not putting it in a good frame. So I think that for me, you know, this kind of situation, like kind of talking with my son how to lie properly, or in which circumstances it's okay to lie and in which it's really something that he shouldn't do, it's something that it's kind of a conversation I needed for myself. And I really, it's not, and you know, and because of this excuse of parental guidance, I could air it out and sort it out, because you know, when I'm professor in university, you know, I cannot sit in a faculty meeting and say, could we really speak now? When is it okay to lie to people? Because actually you had a really ugly haircut, and I'm contemplating if I should tell you if it's ugly, or should I say, oh, you had a haircut, and smile a fake smile. You know, I can't do it there, but I can do it with my son.
And, you know, I think what you're both describing is also this move, you know, allowing yourself to become, in a way, you could say, secondary characters in your own story. And it somehow reminded me also of what Jonathan was talking about in the beginning, of suddenly having, you know, like starting to move yourself away from your head and going into a different kind of conscience, sorry. And just, unfortunately, we need to wrap up. But if you could say something finally about that, you know, like this shift, because it's not just an individual shift, it's also, if we're talking about climate change, it's sort of a big collective shift that we need to start undertaking. I don't know if you want to begin, Jonathan.
Well, you know, it's interesting how we responded to COVID. Who would have thought that we would be capable of closing down our schools, of closing down our local and national and global economies, of quarantining, of closing borders and not traveling, of wearing masks all the time. I'm not sure in advance of it that I would have thought it was possible. So then the question is, why was it possible? You know, we knew and still know far less about COVID than we know about climate change. And as horrible as COVID is, it is dwarfed by climate change, the catastrophe ahead of us. So why is it that we were reasonably good at responding in very broad ways and very rapidly to COVID? I think it's because we feared for ourselves, even if it was unlikely, we knew there was a chance that we could die. People like us were dying. Even if it was extremely unlikely, we knew that some kids were getting terribly sick. And we are extremely good at acting in our own interest. The problem is we are not going to die from climate change. And I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that our kids will die. I don't think that that's part of our emotional or mental imaginations. In order to respond to climate change, we need to make a kind of leap of empathy, because there already are people who are dying, many people. They're just not us, and they're not where we are speaking to this audience. They are either halfway around the planet or they are in the future. And so the question is, are we going to be able to make a shift from our moral imaginations being constrained with the vision of ourselves at the center as the stars of the movie, with the soundtrack playing for us? Or can we make changes in our own lives in the interest of other people's lives? If Trump or Netanyahu had said, we're going to shut down the economy so that people in Bangladesh don't get coronavirus, forget it. Never would have happened. If Trump had said, hey, America, can we just wash our hands very carefully so that people in Bangladesh don't die? People wouldn't have washed their hands. It's not because humans are evil. It's because we are built in a certain way and our moral imaginations are constrained. They're very limited. So we have to find ways to overcome that. I don't believe, or I don't have a whole lot of hope that we're capable of doing it just because we want to do it, which is why we need laws in place and we need structures of habits, like scaffoldings, like Etgar was talking about earlier, that will compel us to do the right thing, even if we're not capable of generating the concern for other people that's necessary.
It's funny, I don't know why it reminded me of something really, really silly, is that when I was in elementary school, we would go on those day trips, and they always tell you that when you have all kinds of garbage, that you should put in a bag and not throw it in the forest or something. And there was this kid in my class that in Israel, especially in the 70s, there was always this kind of narrative that there are all the Arab countries around us and they all want to kill us and to conquer the land, and that's why we need to have a strong army. And it was something that was very, very dominant. And I remember that this kid would tell me, as we would go on trips, he would throw garbage all over. And he said, when the Arab nations will flood the earth and they kill all of us, let them clean it. Let them clean it. And I think that there is something in this kind of idea that about the climate change, that you don't have this sense of emergency, or I don't even say the sense of emergency. I think that we have so many other emergencies around us, like more kind of urgent ones, that it's like it would be tougher to convince me to go and have a colonoscopy, when there are wolves running after me, down the street. I would say, what, some other day, okay? I don't want to go to the doctor now. And I don't know how it feels in the States, but I feel that in Israel, there are always, there are always something that feels like a greater atrocity or a greater and closer, more immediate danger. And the way that it is, I think that it's like, I don't know, it's like trying to convince somebody on a subway not to mug you as the train is going over the cliff, So maybe, I don't know, maybe the priorities are wrong, but with me, it always seems that for me, when you talk to me about the climate change and say, yeah, how about we'll sort the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then together with the Palestinian, we will solve the climate change. And the moment that you say that, it can be very self-defeating, I admit.
So I think we're unfortunately out of time. I would have loved to just continue talking to you, but the dog got the last word, and then Etgar. But thank you so much for participating, and thank you, Asaf, also for organizing the festival.
Thank you. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I'm sure that Agnon was a bit floating above your conversation, and I wish you could join you and answer also these questions about animal and climate change. What could he say? I really want to thank you both, Jonathan Safran Foer and Etgar Keret and Kathrine Tschemerinsky for this conversation. Thank you very much. We are